You think this is some kind of comedy show? The words sliced through the stifling heat of the engine compartment like a blade. Lieutenant Commander Brooks, his pristine white uniform already darkening with sweat stains, stood rigid behind a wall of dead monitors. His contempt was laser-focused on a figure near the massive silent turbine. An old man, maybe 75, wearing faded blue coveralls that had seen decades of honest work. His weathered hands, permanently stained with grease and oil, rested calmly at his sides. He was William "Bill" Hayes, a name that meant absolutely nothing to the dozen frustrated engineers now watching this confrontation unfold. For 72 crushing hours, the USS Patriot, one of America's most advanced aircraft carriers, had been a floating coffin in the Pacific. A catastrophic propulsion failure had silenced her mighty heart, leaving 5,000 souls stranded. Elite engineering teams had failed. Computer diagnostics had failed. Every protocol in the book had been exhausted. Yet here stood this relic in work clothes, studying the dead machine with the quiet intensity of a man who saw something they were all missing. The tension was suffocating. Before we continue, if you've ever been underestimated because of your age or experience, type "respect" below. And tell me where you're watching from. This story of William Hayes proves that wisdom comes from years of service, not degrees on a wall. I read every comment. The confrontation had been building since the moment Rear Admiral Kane had escorted the old man into what Brooks considered his domain. Brooks was everything the modern Navy prided itself on. MIT educated, simulation trained, fluent in digital systems and thermal dynamics. He understood nuclear propulsion on a theoretical level that would impress any Pentagon briefing room. But the engines wouldn't start, and this fossil was somehow supposed to be the answer? "Sir, I asked you a direct question," Brooks snapped, his voice echoing off the steel walls. "Who authorized your presence in a restricted nuclear facility?" Bill Hayes didn't turn around. He continued his slow, methodical examination of the turbine housing, running his fingers along conduits with the gentle touch of a surgeon. To the watching engineers, it looked like an old man lost in his own world. To someone who understood machinery, it looked like a master reading the soul of a sick patient. The silence stretched. Brooks felt his authority slipping with each passing second. These were his people, his department. He was responsible for this failure, and every minute the ship remained dead in the water was another nail in his career's coffin. "Answer me," Brooks demanded, taking a step closer. "I don't care who brought you here. This is a crisis situation involving classified nuclear systems. I will not have some civilian contractor wandering around playing with equipment he doesn't understand." That's when Admiral Kane stepped forward, his weathered face grim. "Commander Brooks," his voice carried the weight of 3 decades at sea, "Master Chief Hayes is here at my personal request. I suggest you show the appropriate respect." "Master Chief?" The title hung in the air like a challenge. Brooks's jaw tightened. An enlisted man, a very old enlisted man. His education, his officer training, his entire identity revolted against the implication that this janitor could solve what he couldn't. "Admiral, with due respect," Brooks' tone dripped with barely contained insubordination, "we're dealing with integrated digital control systems, not some World War II steam engine. My team has degrees from the best technical schools in the country. We don't need folk wisdom. We need qualified engineers." The insult was deliberate and unmistakable. Several of the younger technicians exchanged glances, sensing the dangerous current flowing between their commanding officer and the mysterious old man who still hadn't spoken a word. What none of them knew was that 2,000 miles away, in a secure command center at Naval Base Norfolk, Fleet Admiral Harrison was receiving a priority message from his aide. The message contained 3 words that would change everything in that engine room. "William Hayes aboard." The Fleet Admiral's face went white, then red, then cold as Arctic steel. Petty Officer Maria Rodriguez had been watching the entire exchange from her position at the auxiliary control station. At 24, she was one of the youngest engineers on the ship, but she had something her superiors lacked. She listened to the old-timers. Her grandfather had been Navy, Korea vintage, and he'd taught her that experience trumped textbooks every time. She'd heard whispers about who this old man might be. Rumors in the fleet traveled faster than official communications, and the name William Hayes had been attached to legends. The Franklin incident in '89, the reactor crisis off the Bering Strait, the man they called the Engine Whisperer. Watching Lieutenant Commander Brooks dismiss him so casually made her stomach turn. "Commander," she said quietly, stepping forward, "maybe we should hear what he has to say. We've tried everything else." Brooks whirled on her, his frustration finding a new target. "Petty Officer Rodriguez, you are out of line. Return to your station immediately. This is not a democracy. This is a nuclear-powered warship, and I am the Chief Engineering Officer." But Rodriguez wasn't backing down. "Sir, with respect, we've had no power for 3 days. Maybe it's time to try something different." The tension crackled. Other engineers began to take sides, some nodding agreement with Rodriguez, others remaining loyal to their commanding officer. The engine room was becoming a battlefield of competing philosophies, old school versus new school, intuition versus technology, humility versus pride. Bill Hayes finally spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying easily through the compartment. "Son," he addressed Brooks without turning around, "I've been listening to sick engines for 50 years. This one's trying to tell you something, but you're not hearing it. I don't need a lecture from—" Brooks began. "The bearing temperature on turbine 3 is running 0. 3 degrees high," Hayes interrupted, still focused on the machinery. "Your sensors show it as normal because it's within tolerance, but it shouldn't be running high at all. That tells me the lubricant flow is restricted." "Not blocked. Restricted. There's a difference." Brooks pulled out his tablet, fingers flying across the screen. "The lubrication system shows all green. Pressure is normal. Flow rates are within parameters. You're wrong." "Am I?" Hayes turned for the first time, his pale blue eyes meeting Brooks with unsettling calm. "When did you last manually verify the backup lubricant pump alignment? Not the computer readout. Manually, with your eyes and hands." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Brooks realized he didn't know. None of them had thought to check. They'd trusted the computers, trusted the digital displays that assured them everything was functioning normally. Chief Petty Officer Davis, a 20-year veteran who'd been quietly watching, stepped forward. "Master Chief," his tone was respectful, almost reverent, "are you suggesting the backup pump isn't properly seated?" Hayes nodded slowly. "It's a mechanical issue masquerading as an electronic failure. The primary pump died, the backup kicked in, but it's not aligned properly. It's pumping at maybe 85% efficiency, enough to keep the system from showing red, not enough to properly lubricate under full load. The computer tries to start the turbine, senses the bearing temperature climbing, and shuts down to prevent damage. That's actually possible," Rodriguez whispered, her engineering mind racing through the implications. Brooks felt control slipping away. "Even if that were true," he said desperately, "the alignment would require a full dry dock procedure. We can't fix that at sea." Hayes smiled for the first time, an expression that somehow managed to be both gentle and terrifying. "Son, I realigned backup pumps in force 10 gales before you were born. But first we need to verify the diagnosis." He reached into his coveralls and withdrew an object that made several engineers gasp. It was ancient, a machinist's stethoscope with tarnished metal and cracked rubber tubing. To the digital generation, it looked like a relic from a museum. To Bill Hayes, it was the most sophisticated diagnostic tool ever created. The sight of the old stethoscope triggered something primal in the engine room. Laughter. Not from everyone, but from enough of the younger engineers to create a wave of mockery that rolled through the compartment like poison gas. "Is he serious?" someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "We've got $1 million diagnostic equipment, and he's going to use that antique? Maybe he should bleed the engine with leeches while he's at it," another voice snickered. Lieutenant Commander Brooks felt vindicated. Finally, proof of what he'd suspected all along. This old man was a relic living in the past, desperately trying to apply Stone Age solutions to Space Age problems. The laughter gave him back his authority. "Master Chief," Brooks said, his tone now openly patronizing, "I appreciate your historical perspective, but we've already run acoustic diagnostics on every bearing, every pump, every component. If there were an irregularity, our sensors would have detected it." Hayes ignored the mockery completely. He approached the backup lubricant pump housing, a cylindrical assembly buried deep in the maze of pipes and conduits. It was positioned in a location that made computer sensors difficult to position, which was why it relied primarily on automated feedback systems. "Petty Officer Rodriguez," Hayes called softly. "Come here, please." Rodriguez glanced nervously at Brooks, who nodded curtly, curious despite himself to see this old fool embarrass himself publicly. "Yes, Master Chief?" "Take this." Hayes handed her the stethoscope. "Place the bell right there on that mounting bracket. Close your eyes and tell me what you hear." Rodriguez took the instrument gingerly, as if it might crumble in her hands. She positioned the bell where Hayes indicated, against the metal housing that secured the backup pump to the engine frame. The compartment fell silent except for the low hum of emergency power. She closed her eyes and listened. At first she heard nothing unusual. The general vibration of a ship at sea, the distant whisper of air conditioning, the barely perceptible pulse of the emergency generators. But Hayes had taught her to listen deeper, and gradually she began to isolate the sounds coming through the metal. There was the expected hum of the pump motor, the rhythmic pulse of the lubricant being moved through the system. But underneath it, something else, a tiny irregularity, a microscopic skip in the rhythm, so subtle it was almost subliminal. Her eyes flew open. "There's a hesitation, like the pump is catching on something." Hayes nodded approvingly. "What you're hearing is the pump impeller brushing against the housing wall. It's only off by a few thousandths of an inch, but at 3,000 RPM that creates heat, vibration, and reduced flow." Chief Davis moved closer, his face grave. "If the pump isn't properly seated, the mounting bolts could be loose. That would cause the alignment to shift under load." "Exactly," Hayes confirmed. "And every time the main engine tries to start, the increased lubricant demand puts more stress on the backup pump, making the misalignment worse. The computer sees rising bearing temperatures and shuts everything down." Brooks was struggling to process this. But the installation was verified. The pump was aligned according to specifications. The technical manual procedures were followed exactly. Specifications written by people who never crawled into an engine room during a storm. Hayes replied quietly. "Sometimes the manual is wrong. Sometimes the machinery settles differently than the engineers in their clean offices expected. Sometimes you have to trust your hands and your ears over your computers." The revelation was spreading through the assembled engineers like a wave. They were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just a mechanical diagnosis, but a philosophy, a way of thinking about their profession that their digital training had never taught them. But Lieutenant Commander Brooks wasn't ready to surrender. His entire identity was built on the superiority of modern methods, on the precise application of scientific principles over what he saw as superstition and guesswork. What he didn't know was that 2,000 miles away, Fleet Admiral Harrison was already airborne. The silence in the engine room was electric. Bill Hayes could feel the shift in atmosphere as the younger engineers began to grasp the implications of what they'd just witnessed. But he also sensed Lieutenant Commander Brooks gathering himself for one final, desperate assertion of authority. Hayes had seen this before, many times. The moment when pride collided with reality, when ego fought against wisdom. Usually, it ended badly for everyone involved. His mind drifted back 30 years, to another engine room, another crisis. The USS Franklin, a guided missile destroyer, had been caught in a Category 4 hurricane off the Aleutian Islands. At 2:30 a.m., during the height of the storm, the main reactor had begun showing signs of coolant system failure. Hayes had been a senior chief then, working under a lieutenant commander remarkably similar to Brooks, young, brilliant, absolutely convinced that computer models and technical manuals contained all the answers the Navy would ever need. The young officer had insisted on following standard shutdown procedures, even as the ship was being thrown around like a toy. But Hayes had heard something in the reactor compartment, a vibration that didn't match any failure mode in the technical literature. He'd pleaded for permission to try a different approach. "Master Chief," the officer had said, "I cannot authorize you to deviate from established safety protocols based on a feeling." Hayes had watched that officer make the same mistake Brooks was making now, mistaking information for wisdom, confusing data for understanding. The result had been a near-catastrophic reactor incident that cost the Navy $200 million in repairs and came within minutes of requiring the ship to be abandoned in the middle of a hurricane. The official investigation had quietly acknowledged that Hayes's unconventional solution would have prevented the entire crisis. More quietly still, the young lieutenant commander had been reassigned to shore duty, his career effectively over. Hayes had learned something that night that no manual could teach. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting that you might be wrong, that your education might be incomplete, that someone with grease under his fingernails might know something you didn't. Back in the present, Brooks was rallying for his final stand. "Master Chief," his voice carried the desperate edge of a man fighting for his professional life, "even assuming your diagnosis is correct, which I'm not conceding, the procedure for realigning a backup lubricant pump requires the engine to be completely shut down, the compartment to be drained, and specialized alignment tools that we don't have aboard ship. What you're suggesting is impossible." Hayes smiled that same gentle, terrifying smile. "Son, I've realigned pumps in seas that would terrify you. I've done it in engine rooms filled with smoke and water, with nothing but a wrench and a prayer. The question isn't whether it can be done. The question is whether you're brave enough to let me try." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet. Brooks realized he was trapped. If he refused and the ship remained dead in the water, his career was finished. If he agreed and Hayes failed, he could blame the old man. But if Hayes succeeded, Petty Officer Rodriguez made the decision for him. "Master Chief," she said firmly, "what do you need?" Hayes looked at her with something approaching paternal pride. "3 things. A 15-16 wrench, a hydraulic jack, and someone with steady hands to monitor the alignment indicators while I work." "I'll do it," Rodriguez volunteered immediately. Chief Davis nodded. "I'll get the tools." Brooks watched his authority evaporate before his eyes. His people were choosing the old man over him, experience over education, wisdom over credentials. The humiliation was crushing, but worse was the growing realization that they might be right. As Hayes began laying out his plan, explaining how he intended to perform a precision mechanical alignment in the middle of the ocean without dry dock facilities, Brooks finally understood what he was witnessing. This wasn't just mechanical knowledge. It was artistry. It was the accumulated wisdom of 5 decades spent listening to machines speak their secret language, and he had almost thrown it away out of pride. The sound of helicopters approaching cut through the tense atmosphere like thunder. Multiple aircraft, heavy birds by the sound of them, approaching the USS Patriot from the east. Lieutenant Commander Brooks looked up instinctively, though the engine compartment had no windows. "Expecting visitors?" Chief Davis asked Admiral Kane. Kane's face had gone ashen. "No," he replied quietly. "No, we're not." Bill Hayes continued his methodical preparation, seemingly unaware of the approaching aircraft. He had Rodriguez positioned at the alignment indicator panel, Davis standing by with tools, and several other engineers watching with fascination as he explained his approach. "The key," Hayes was saying, "is to remember that the pump mounting isn't just about mechanical precision. It's about understanding how metal behaves under stress, how thermal expansion affects alignment, how vibration patterns change when components aren't quite where they should be." Brooks found himself drawn in despite his resistance. The old man's knowledge was encyclopedic, but more than that, it was intuitive. He understood these machines the way a conductor understands an orchestra, sensing harmonies and discordances that others missed entirely. Above them, the helicopters were landing. Multiple aircraft, which meant this wasn't a routine supply run. Someone important was arriving, and Brooks had a sick feeling he knew why. Hayes began his work. Using techniques that weren't in any manual, he started the delicate process of adjusting the pump alignment while the system remained pressurized. It was dangerous, requiring split-second timing and absolute precision. One wrong move could turn a mechanical problem into a hydraulic disaster. "Watch the indicator," he instructed Rodriguez. "When I lift, you'll see the alignment shift. The moment it hits the green zone, you tell me to stop. Not before, not after, exactly when it hits optimal." Rodriguez nodded, her hands poised over the controls. Around them, the engine room had become a surgical theater, with everyone holding their breath as Hayes began the impossible task of realigning a critical component on a ship that was rolling gently in 5-foot swells. That's when they heard footsteps on the ladder. Multiple sets of boots, moving with the precise cadence of an official delegation. Admiral Kane straightened unconsciously, recognizing the sound of serious authority approaching. The first person through the hatch wasn't who anyone expected. It was a rear admiral, 2 stars gleaming on his collar, followed by what appeared to be an entire command staff. They moved into the engine room like they owned it, which Brooks suddenly realized they probably did. "Admiral Kane," the 2 stars' voice carried absolute authority. "I'm Rear Admiral Patterson, representing Fleet Command. We need to speak with Master Chief Hayes immediately." The engine room fell silent except for the sound of Hayes continuing his work, completely focused on the delicate task of micro-adjusting the pump alignment. Rodriguez watched her indicators like a hawk, waiting for that perfect moment when all the mechanical forces would balance. "Master Chief Hayes," Admiral Patterson called formally. "Sir, Fleet Admiral Harrison sends his compliments and has asked me to personally ensure you have everything you require." That's when Lieutenant Commander Brooks' world completely collapsed. Fleet Admiral Harrison, the highest-ranking officer in the United States Navy. He knew this old man personally. More than that, he respected him enough to send a 2-star admiral and a full command staff to check on him. "Now," Hayes said quietly to Rodriguez. "Stop," she called immediately. "Perfect alignment achieved." Hayes straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. The backup lubricant pump was now properly aligned, ready to support full engine operations. The mechanical problem that had stumped an entire team of educated engineers for 3 days had been solved by an old man with a wrench and 50 years of experience. Admiral Patterson stepped forward, his bearing formal and respectful. "Master Chief Hayes, the Fleet Admiral has asked me to convey his personal regards and to inform you that your service to the Navy continues to be appreciated at the highest levels." Brooks stood frozen, watching his career crumble as the truth became unmistakably clear. He hadn't just dismissed some old maintenance worker, he had disrespected a living legend. The main engine startup sequence began with a sound that sent chills down every spine in the compartment. The deep, thrumming hum of a nuclear reactor coming online after 3 days of silence. Warning lights flashed amber, then green. Control panels that had been dark for 72 hours suddenly blazed with life. Bill Hayes stood quietly beside Rodriguez as she managed the startup procedure, his weathered hands resting calmly at his sides. The old machinist's stethoscope hung around his neck like a medal of honor. "Turbine 1 online," Rodriguez called out, her voice tight with concentration. "Lubricant flow nominal. Bearing temperatures optimal. Turbine 2 online. All parameters green. Turbine 3 online." "Master Chief, the bearing that was running hot is now operating at exactly the correct temperature." The roar of the main engines filled the compartment, a sound that every sailor in the engine room had missed with an almost physical ache. The USS Patriot was alive again, her massive screws biting into the Pacific Ocean, her nuclear heart beating strong and steady. But the celebration was muted by the presence of Admiral Patterson and his staff, who had witnessed the entire startup procedure with the intense attention of men who understood exactly how close they had come to losing a billion-dollar warship and 5,000 lives. Admiral Patterson stepped forward, his voice cutting through the engine noise. "Master Chief William Hayes." His tone was formal, ceremonial. "I am directed by Fleet Admiral Harrison to read the following commendation." The engine room fell silent except for the healthy hum of properly functioning machinery. "Master Chief Hayes, your actions aboard the USS Patriot represent the finest traditions of the United States Navy. Faced with a catastrophic system failure that had defeated multiple engineering teams using the most advanced diagnostic equipment available, you applied 5 decades of experience, intuitive mechanical knowledge, and the wisdom that comes only from a lifetime of faithful service to identify and correct the problem. Patterson paused, letting the words sink in. Lieutenant Commander Brooks stood rigid at attention, his face pale, knowing his own actions were about to be addressed. Furthermore, your professional conduct in the face of disrespectful treatment from a junior officer demonstrates the character and dignity that have made you a legend in the engineering community. The Fleet Admiral has asked me to personally apologize for the discourtesy you experienced and to assure you that appropriate corrective action will be taken. Hayes nodded quietly, his expression unchanged. Admiral, the ship is running properly. That's all that matters. But Patterson wasn't finished. He turned to address the assembled engineers, his voice carrying the weight of fleet-wide policy. Let this be a lesson to all of you. The United States Navy is built on the accumulated wisdom of generations of sailors who learned their craft through experience, dedication, and humility. Technology is a tool, a magnificent tool, but it is not a replacement for understanding, for intuition, for the kind of knowledge that comes from listening to machines with your heart as well as your mind. His gaze settled on Brooks, who stood at rigid attention, his career hanging by a thread. Lieutenant Commander Brooks, you will report to Admiral Kane's quarters immediately following this ceremony. Your conduct toward Master Chief Hayes was unbecoming of an officer and will be formally addressed. The Admiral then turned back to Hayes, his official manner softening slightly. Master Chief, the Fleet Admiral has also asked me to convey that your insights into engine diagnostics and maintenance procedures will be formally incorporated into the Naval Engineering Manual. Your knowledge will live on in the training of future generations of naval engineers. Hayes smiled for the first time since the crisis began. That's good, he said quietly. These young people are smart. They just need to learn to listen. The ceremony concluded, but the real transformation was just beginning. The story of what had happened in the engine room of the USS Patriot would spread throughout the fleet within days, becoming part of Navy legend. 6 months later, at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, a new course was added to the engineering curriculum. It was called Applied Mechanical Intuition, and it was taught using the Hayes method, combining digital diagnostics with hands-on mechanical assessment techniques. The first slide of the first lecture showed an old machinist's stethoscope next to a $1 million computer diagnostic system. The caption read, "Both are tools. Wisdom is knowing when to use which one." Lieutenant Commander Brooks, after completing a mandatory leadership remediation course, was reassigned to shore duty where he spent 2 years studying under veteran petty officers, learning the practical aspects of engineering that his formal education had missed. The experience humbled him and ultimately made him a better officer and a better human being. Petty Officer Rodriguez was promoted to Chief Petty Officer ahead of schedule and became one of the Navy's youngest female engineering instructors. She kept Hayes's old stethoscope in her office as a reminder that the most sophisticated diagnostic tool is an open mind. Bill Hayes returned to his quiet retirement in Maine, but not before the Secretary of the Navy personally presented him with the Navy's highest civilian honor for his service aboard the USS Patriot. The citation noted that his actions had prevented potential loss of life and equipment valued at over $1 billion. More importantly, Hayes had reminded the Navy of something essential, that wisdom isn't found in manuals or computers, but in the accumulated experience of people who have dedicated their lives to understanding their craft at the deepest possible level. The USS Patriot continues to sail, her engines running smoothly, maintained by engineers who now understand that listening is just as important as knowing. To everyone who typed respect and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our veterans. Subscribe for more stories like this and unsung American heroes. See you in the next one.